What prison are you locked up in? A little more than midway on the final journey to Jerusalem, Jesus stops for dinner at the house of an important man, a leader of the Jewish Pharisees. The Pharisees are a religiously and politically influential group with high status, and they could use some lessons in table etiquette. At the Sabbath dinner with the Pharisees, Jesus whips out his old copy of Miss Manners' Guide to Table Etiquette, and he throws in a sprinkling of Machiavelli's advice on court strategy. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, Jesus says, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone who is more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host may come to you and say, give this person your place, and then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. You will be humiliated for your social climbing, Jesus says. Shame and dishonor will clothe you. These Hellenized Jews are very conscious of social standing. Every man who goes to a feast knows his own status and ranked value. The value and respect accorded to him by his neighbors could fit neatly on the head of a pin. That pin could be plotted along an imaginary line that extends from the host at the head of the table all the way to the far end at the table's foot. Most of the time, the pin would be embedded somewhere in the middle of the imaginary line, halfway up the table. Nobody wants to sit at the foot of the table. If your pin lands near the foot of the table, it means you are one of the invisible. It's as if you went out to a dinner party tonight after church, and there was a long table the length of an Olympic pool. At the head of the table sat President Obama, Beyoncé, Taylor Swift, Bill Gates, Hillary Clinton, even Warren Buffett and Toni Morrison. A little further down the table, but sitting close to these celebrities, would be lots of billionaires, people who are not famous, but who are very good at climbing to the top. And then, down at the foot of the table, you don't know any of the people. Some people at the foot of the table are rolled in on wheelchairs. Next to them are illiterate Mexican immigrants, and next to them are ordinary housewives, their shoulders and legs purple from midnight beatings. Nearby, still toward the foot of the table, are alcoholics and drug abusers with secret habits. A little up from them, inching up the table, are brown-skinned Muslims of all shapes and sizes, and then next to them are young black men in hoodies. You are at this dinner feast. You don't actually see any of these people at the foot of the table. You don't see the Mexicans, the Muslims, the abused women, because they are invisible, and you hurry past to find your place somewhere at the middle of the table. You want to be up a little closer to Beyoncé or Michelle Obama. Even having Ivanka, Donald Trump's daughter, turn to smile at you as from her seat next to Chelsea would make you happy. You think this is ridiculous, a priestly fantasy. Stop. Remember the high school cafeteria? Where did you sit? Remember family holidays when you were a child and all the kids were placed at the kids' table and the grown-ups gathered by themselves at the big table? Then came the year you turned 11 or 12, and you decided you were old enough and important enough to join the adults. No more kids' table for you. But your aunt looked cross-eyed at you and said, "No way, Jose," and sent you back to sit with your rowdy, sniffly cousins. You are angry and humiliated, pouting back at the kids' table. You felt invisible and misunderstood. But now you're all grown up. You can sit at the adult table. You can find a respectable spot, maybe close enough to see or touch someone important. No, you can actually be important. And that is where Jesus comes in. And I'm afraid to say, you still don't get to sit at the big people's table. The big people's table is not what heaven is made of, because even if everyone can see you, you become blind when you sit with the big people. The big people's table is like a house lit up at night. Others can see in, but you can't see out. You lose sight when you schmooze at the head of the table. Jesus has an answer for our blindness. Jesus describes a future wedding feast to which only you and the folk at the end of the table, the victims of poverty and abuse, receive invitations. This is what heaven is made of. Jesus tells the host, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. That wedding banquet that Jesus describes is the future kingdom of heaven, and it is also right here now on earth. Through the power of the Holy Spirit, Jesus works through us to bring it about. The poor, the crippled, the victims of sex trafficking, the Muslims are among us on earth, and too often they are invisible because we keep looking up toward the head of the table. Jesus teaches us to look, to get up and walk down to the bottom of the table. There's a sequence of moves in gymnastics called the biles. We saw it a lot last week at the Olympics. Simone Biles, the young American phenom, flipped, flew, and charmed on her way to 5 medals at the Rio Olympics. Biles, all 4'8" of her, is all liquid power, as if she could jump straight from earth to heaven. Her muscles ripple, but she never seems to sweat. Her luminous feline smile makes gymnastics appear so easy, as if you or I, with just a little remedial training, could begin to turn aerial somersaults right here in the aisle. Biles took Rio by storm. She was a mighty female athlete. So compare her for a moment to another brown-skinned woman who's been in the news this week. Compare Biles to the Muslim woman forced to strip on a beach in Nice, France. More than 30 towns in France have banned burkinis, outfits worn for religious reasons which cover a woman's entire body, except her face, hands, and feet. An armed police squadron approached the sunbathing woman. The men loomed over the bikini-clad Muslim and ordered her to remove parts of her clothing. She meekly complied and was stripped, not only of her clothes, but her power and identity. I'm not commenting on France's well-earned fear of Islamic terrorism. I'm not questioning the mayor of Nice, who, in defending the police action, declared he must free women from the trappings of male subjugation. I am talking about the utter loneliness of the Muslim woman. She crouched on the stony shore and pulled off her blue covering as if she would melt of shame. Unlike Biles standing before flashing cameras, visible to all the world in her grace and power, the Muslim woman is invisible. She is stripped of her identity and humanity. We are not told her name, her face is blurred, only her surrender into shame and fear are visible. The cold eyes of the world judge her. Did she wear a burkini as an act of protest? Is she a willing victim of a male-dominated, repressive, totalitarian religion? Such pressing questions flood the internet. On the beach, in the sea of mostly naked white bodies and looming blue police, the woman is quite alone and invisible. Ethical loneliness, it's that experience described by the philosopher Jill Stouffer when you are abandoned by humanity. It is the black hole of nothingness, when you scream but your voice is not heard. It is the mind-fatiguing emptiness of the man in solitary confinement. It is the stunned cries of the tortured prisoner. A man named Jean Amery suffered this loneliness in the concentration camps of Germany. During World War II, he was a member of the Belgian resistance. Later, he was tortured by the Nazis and imprisoned in Auschwitz. He survived, but killed himself in 1978, before the world had come to recognize or name the Holocaust. The first blow by his torturers was the worst, he later wrote, because the first blow brings home to the prisoner that he is helpless. Torture, the first crack of rubber against bone, transforms a human being into a body. The concrete immediacy of the blow announces that daily life up until now has been nothing but an abstraction. The second blow, hard wood against jaw, tells the mind inside the body that it is absolutely powerless. Order, logic, justice fly out the window. Torture traps you inside yourself. There's nowhere for the mind to rest. Amery writes that the very worst of what befell him in the years of torture and imprisonment was the loss of power, and all he could do was despair of human help. He had become invisible, abandoned by the world, by justice, and by humanity. After Amery's release, he was returned to human society, but his self as visible being had been destroyed, and he could never again return to human relationship. So I ask you, who are America's tortured? Who are our abandoned, invisible bodies? You all have heard the litany of some of their names. Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American, was shot down by a policeman in Ferguson, Missouri. Eric Garner gasped his last words, "I can't breathe," crushed beneath a swarm of cops in Staten Island, New York. 25-year-old Freddie Gray's spine was almost severed in a van in Baltimore, Maryland. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, their names are the roll call of the dead, throbbing on the American consciousness. Like an ancient lamentation, they sound a drumbeat of despair, a pistol's pop, a breath's final gurgle, and heave the almost silent splintering of vertebrae. But these are the names we know. These are the men who are visible, victims of humiliation, torture, and death. The invisible are all around us, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, and in our prisons. The United States imprisons almost 2.5 million human beings, more people per capita than any other country, behind Rwanda and Russia. Almost 40% of those human beings are African American. We must not abandon these invisible men. We must name the reality, make the invisible visible. In today's epistle, Paul continues Jesus' teaching. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured as though you yourself were being tortured. A friend of mine was tutoring African American kids in a project in Southeast DC. My friend is a tall, slender young white man, and he was helping a young black student write a letter for a social studies class. The little boy could hardly spell and was terribly embarrassed. The young white man felt out of place as an authority figure. But no one questioned the nature of the assignment, which was to write a letter to Abraham Lincoln to thank him for freeing the slaves. As children, many of us have written letters like this in school, and it seems right and true to thank one of our greatest presidents for bringing freedom from slavery to our divided country. But I ask you, why is a small black boy thanking a large white man for his birthright? Why are not he and his white classmates writing letters to the boy's great-grandparents, to American slaves, to thank them for holding on to their dignity in slavery for struggling to remain visible. We must not abandon our children, and we must not ignore our history. We must name the reality and make the invisible visible. Thousands of years ago, many civilizations did not have a word for the color blue. Scientists and scholars have puzzled over this strange phenomenon, which appears to be true of most ancient cultures. The scholars and scientists reasoned that there was no word for blue because people didn't see the color blue. Except for the sky, there were no blue things for them to touch or talk about. Only the ancient Egyptians, who could make the color blue from minerals, had a word blue. The color blue was like the men in prison. Unless we name them, unless we visit them, touch their hands, speak out for them, they will remain invisible. Blue is the color of slavery and racism. Blue is the blouse of the Muslim woman on the beach in France. Unless we see her as a human being, as visible and worthy of adoration as Simone Biles, we will be imprisoned like the Belgian man Jean Amory in our own solitary confinement. Instead, Paul says, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to do good and to name the invisible, for such sacrifices are pleasing to our God. Amen.